And, all right, thank you for selecting Investigating Social Vulnerability Analysis and Implementation in Emergency Management. At this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to Ms. Morris. And if you have any questions, please toss them out in the chat arena, and we will get them, or Ms. Morris will get them answered as soon as she can. Ms. Morris, thank you.
Hello, everybody. Let me just figure out how to share my presentation. For some reason, my PowerPoint wasn't showing up this time, so let me just reload it real quick and we'll get started. Oops. Hold on just a second. Sorry about that.
Actually, while you're doing that, we've already got a question popped up. Yay. Is there a particular vulnerable population you are covering?
Yes. So we will be covering the demographics involving age, income, and education. So there's been a lot of studies on how certain variables have actually impacted people's ability to survive storms, but also recover from them. So we're going to be covering how you can actually check out your jurisdiction and map that out and know exactly where those people are for pre-planning purposes and also response. And now that my drive is loaded, I will pull this up real quick. Thank you guys for your patience. Okay, so let's see if Zoom will pick up on it now. It should. Well, okay, there it is. Let's share entire screen. All right, can everybody see this?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. So I had to set it to share my entire screen rather than share the tab, and so I cannot see anything but the presentation. So if anybody has any questions or anything, just shout at me. We're gonna go ahead and get started. So first of all, thank you for choosing my room. My name is Ashley Morris. I'm currently an emergency management planner with Baltimore County, Homeland Security and Emergency Management. I've been here for about 6 months. Previously, I was actually out in Fairfax County doing a lot of the community engagement, outreach, and social media work with them before I took the position up here. And so I really enjoyed my time out there in Virginia. And I'm very happy to be up here in Region 3 after actually coming from Texas and starting my career about 4 years ago doing local level emergency management outside of the Austin area. Previous to that, I'm very excited to talk about social vulnerability mapping today. I actually did my thesis work on this, and so we're going to go over some of the research on what social vulnerability is and how we can actually apply it to local jurisdictions to really help us maximize a lot of the local emergency management efforts that we're doing. A lot of us don't have a lot of capacity. I've worked in several offices of just 2 people, 3 people. We wear a ton of different hats and we have a lot of priorities. So it's really important that we are aware of the people who need to be served the most so we can build resiliency and maximize our efforts by targeting the areas that need it the most, and also direct the limited resources that we have. So an overview of what we're going to be kind of talking about today. I want to give an overhead of what social vulnerability is, what the definition of it is. It is a hotter topic nowadays, especially over the past couple of years after we've discovered some social vulnerability challenges with the pandemic and other local incidents that we have been working on. We're also going to go over the data, so how we can look at census data and other free data to actually put together the maps that we will need as a local jurisdiction to use it. And free is really important, especially for us that work in small offices and do not have the funding to maybe purchase somebody to make me a map. We're going to go into how you can make a social vulnerability map, and it's going to be an overview of how you can do that. The good and the bad. So what are some benefits with the social vulnerability index and the maps, as well as some of the drawbacks. some real world examples, some key takeaways, and then also some ideas of how we can put it into action locally to start to really maximize preparedness, response, and recovery in those areas. So I probably don't have to take a ton of time to talk to everybody on this or at this conference to remind everybody that we are extremely busy, right? Like I said, come from a very small office, have never had a lot of staff except when I was at Fairfax County. That was definitely a blessing being able to have a big office there. But previous to that, an office of 1 or 2. Currently, we just have 2 staff members here. And so I've learned very effectively that you have to have very good time management, and you're very limited with what you can do in preparedness, response, and recovery and everything that we need to do. On top of that, over the past 2 years, we've had a ton of different incidents that we've been responding to, and we have to really balance all of that and really try to build preparedness and resiliency on top of all of the challenges that we have working in smaller local level governments. So it's really important, because we're so small, or we don't have the staff, or we don't necessarily have the budget that we wish that we would have in all of our jurisdictions, to EM with a purpose. So making sure that we're kind of assessing where all of our efforts are going, what actions we're taking, how we can maximize that, like I mentioned in the beginning, to get the biggest output for the input in our areas. Things that we wear many hats to do include preparedness activities, right? That could be emergency planning, conducting exercises, doing county preparedness, doing disaster outreach with the community, doing resource assessment. So figuring out what we have as an agency or what we have as a county with our partners, as well as what nonprofits and our private sector and all of our relationships that we have outside of the county for resources and agreements and things like that. Also pre-planning, we do a lot of that, and mitigation. So we're trying to do all of these tasks all at once, basically with a small amount of resources. And so social vulnerability can really help point us in the right direction and help us maximize that energy so that we're making the biggest the biggest changes and getting the biggest bang for the buck there. And we're really trying to save the lives and cut back on any disaster losses in areas that we know we're going to have fatalities, as well as trouble with resiliency and recovery. So what the heck is social vulnerability, and how should I use it? To kind of just give an overview definition of what social vulnerability is. Basically, it is a concept that as a human being, I have a lot of different demographics of my lifestyles, of how I was born, how I was raised, what resources I have, what education I have. All of these demographics and these variables with my life actually can impact whether or not I live or die in a tornado, I survive or recover from a disaster, I have the time or the resources to do the preparedness stuff that my office is asking me to do, or my community and my government's asking me to do, as well as other things like family networks, friend networks, things that we know with disaster research, but also as emergency managers, that you really have to be able to be resilient and also recover and rebuild after we have a massive incident. And so it is a human-induced situation caused by variables like resource distribution that heavily impact our disaster outcomes. There are several different kinds of vulnerability with people that have been studied with disasters. This includes physical, psychological, and then social. We're going to be covering social, which is going to be looking at census, looking at people's demographics, and trying to figure out how the demographic makeup can actually influence how somebody is set up to be able to recover, and also how we can use that to do planning to put them on a better pedestal to be able to do a more effective job at recovering. And so we're going to be focusing on that. The slide does say that this is a new concept, and it is a newer concept, but like I said, this is very hot topic nowadays, especially coming out of the pandemic, and especially with us having an understanding that certain populations or certain people with certain backgrounds will be impacted by disasters differently and will come out of disasters differently. So looking at the supporting research, we have a ton of research that does actually show that these social variables with social vulnerability do actually make a difference, whether or not somebody is not injured during a disaster, is injured during a disaster, or is even killed during a disaster. And if you take a look at a lot of the demographics of disaster fatalities, whether or not it's hurricanes, wildfires, pandemic, a lot of different disasters that we have, you will see that a lot of them fit the same variables that have turned up time and time again. These variables include race and ethnicity, age, income, household characteristics, such as maybe they lived alone, as well as education. So we can actually take a look at what these vulnerable variables are and actually have an idea in our communities where those networks and neighborhoods are, so we can make sure that we're really trying to put in planning effort, public information effort, and outreach effort to the people that are automatically going to be more vulnerable to dying in a disaster or having a hard time with recovering. Regions of high social vulnerability, especially those blocks or those cities or those areas in your jurisdiction that are higher with those demographics, they are thought to have less storm resources available to them, whether or not they went out and purchased them and were able to build a kit or do things like that. Also, they have an ability to be less prepared, a higher chance of injury or death, like I mentioned, and also have the most financial damage because with those variables, typically, if people are challenged with putting food on the table or living daily life, they're not necessarily going to go out and buy a flood insurance program policy, right? So we know that their recovery is going to be challenged when a lot of our recovery processes rely on people having access to those kinds of resources. So why is this relevant to emergency management? What does this mean to us? Basically, like I've been trying to preach, if we can target these areas in our jurisdiction with actions that reduce their risk, we can actually make sure to reduce fatalities, reduce loss, and once again, build resiliency and recover faster. We can target and steer educational outreach campaigns, provided resources such as storm shelters, cooling centers, warming centers, all of those things that we're trying to provide. We can pinpoint areas that need them the most in our community and put our effort there because we know people are going to need them. They're going to be accessible to them. And we're going to be building the strength and resiliency there by doing that. We can also create and change. So if we know that we have areas in our jurisdiction that are highly socially vulnerable, we can look at ways to create resources or change what that layout looks like through different disaster planning methods and other things like that. We can also save and minimize. That's going to be saving lives, saving property, and also minimizing dollars that we're spending responding, but also recovering in the long term. So we're going to go into how to make a social vulnerability index map, whether or not you're in a city, a county, or even a state level. Everybody will have access to this data and will be able to actually put this map together so you have an overview of what your social vulnerability footprint looks like. So first of all, I'm a very big fan of doing social vulnerability mapping with census data because census data is free, right? We don't have a ton of access to resources to go out and necessarily survey everyone ourselves. Census data is thorough, it's consistent, it's the best way to know what whole community that we have and what community we're trying to serve. And so that's where we're actually going to pull the variables to look at our social vulnerability index. When we're looking at US Census data, there are several different kinds of US Census data. Obviously, the census is done every 10 years, and so they just went ahead and did the 2020 update. And so when that data comes out, that's going to be very up to date since we're in 2021. But if I was looking at social vulnerability in 2025 or 2026, that data might not be effective for me if my jurisdiction is changing a lot, whether or not with population growth or decline, if I have a lot of people moving in and out, my demographics aren't going to match up correctly. So it is best, instead of doing the 10-year census data, to actually look at the US Census data that is called the American Community Survey. So this is actually done every 1 year, 3 year, and 5 years. And while there's a little more sampling error and it's not as thorough as the 10 years, it is the most up-to-date that you can possibly get. You want to make sure that the data that you're pulling is at the census block group level. So that just means that we're zooming in on your jurisdiction and we're picking an area that is more fine than a census tract or a county. We're really looking at that. And we're also picking the 5-year data. So that's going to be your 60 months of sample data all added up of census surveys that they did. It has the less amount of error and it's going to give you the best results. So that's the best data to pull when you're looking at demographics. To actually map your demographics, you're going to want to find a jurisdiction census block group. Since we're doing census block group for the census data, you want it to line up with the map. And you're going to find a shapefile for that. So many of us are lucky enough, hopefully, to have somebody that works for your jurisdiction doing GIS planning and doing mapping, whether or not it's for city, county planning or for other needs. So you can easily reach out to your GIS guru who's going to be able to help you put this map together. And they could also probably even have input on some of the analysis that they're doing for you. If you don't have that and you do have funding, you can look at third-party companies to do it. That is an option if that is available to you. But if you have a GIS guru or you're a guru yourself, you can actually put this map together for free and be able to look at this stuff to help with your planning processes. So choosing your variables. We touched a little bit on what variables have come up in research as being what is considered highly vulnerable. And it's going to be these 5 that have consistently showed up. So with race and ethnicity, that's going to be our underserved populations, our minority populations. With age, it's going to be our elderly above 65, and it's going to be our minors under 18. For income, it's going to be everybody below the poverty line. For household type, it's going to be people who live in trailers or people who do not live in sturdy homes. That is especially relevant for storm disasters like tornadoes or any of that, those kinds of things where we're trying to do mitigation plans or codes to try to enhance survival from some of these disasters as well as recovery. And then education, it is anybody who does not have a high school diploma. So those are the demographics that time over time in research, and also when looking at fatalities and also looking at impacts, those are the ones that are consistently coming up as challenges for vulnerability. Keep in mind when you're actually putting together this map, you can actually add or subtract any of the variables that you prefer to do. So if there's another variable that maybe you know your jurisdiction has on the census, a great example is access to vehicles. Believe it or not, ACS data can actually show you everybody who doesn't have a car or a sample size of everyone that doesn't have a car. You could add that and include them in your census block map so you can kind of target those areas for things like transportation, right? So the cool thing about this is while we're going to be sticking with these 5 variables because these are the consistent ones, you can modify and add what variables you might think could be a problem for your jurisdiction or a challenge. So with actually putting these variables together to create an index, we're actually going to be doing a lot of adding and creating ratios and creating averages. So warning, there is some math coming up, but it's not hard math. So everybody is easily able to do it. When you're actually going through the variables and combining them to make one scale, you can actually weight them or not weight them or choose how to weight them however you want to. Unfortunately, with the research right now, there is no set way to actually do a weighted method. Some researchers prefer to weight certain variables more than others. Other researchers prefer to keep all of the variables equal weight on the scale. And then some researchers have even done a ranking system with professionals where they asked other professionals in emergency management about what ones they thought would be more impactful. useful. So for us, we're going to stick to just keeping everything equally weighted because it's easiest for the math, but also because there's not a lot of research that says that income is more significant than education. The research just isn't there yet. Okay, so to give kind of an overview of this process of how you can put it together, I do want to encourage everybody to take pictures of the slides. I do have all of the calculations and everything out for you to be able to go through later and kind of help you with that assembly process. For the presentation, I'm not going to lecture on math for 15 minutes because I think that would be very painful, as well as a challenge for people to understand in a conference presentation. So I do encourage everybody to save the slides. The slides will also be available on the website after the conference, and then you can also reach out to me if you have any questions while you're doing this. But we're going to do a 10,000-foot view on how you can easily put together the census totals for your jurisdiction to get that summary map. So step one, we're going to choose those variables. So we already discussed what variables were high risk or high vulnerable, right? And if you look in the center of the screen, that is actually going to be the example of my jurisdiction. So the square is my city. The 1, the 2, and the 3 are the different block groups that I have inside my city. So this looks just like a city map with census block groups on the map. And so while we're looking at this city, we have 3 census block groups, and we have a total population of 1,000 people in this city. And as an emergency manager, and I just got a explanation on what kind of variables I should use, I decided for this analysis that I want to assess income, education, and age. So remember, with income, that's going to be everybody below the poverty line. For education, that's going to be everybody below high school diploma. And for age, that's going to be everybody below the age of 18 or above the age of 65. So I'm going to pull all of those numbers from that census data that I collected, and I'm going to figure out the counts in each of the census blocks. So for the city total, for the income under the poverty line, that's going to be 30 total people. For education, with no diploma, it's going to be 15 total people. And for age, we're going to have 55 total in the city. And then we break that down by block 1 and block 2. So you can see income 17 people, education 9 people, and so on and so forth. So I know what variables I chose, I know how many people fit those variables, and I know what block group those variables and those people are located in. Next, after I have the total variables and how many people are located in each block group, we're going to divide every block group variable by the total number in the city. So you're taking the average by however many people are below the poverty line in block group 1 as compared to everyone in the city, right? So 17 divided by 30. So once you do the block total divided by the variable city total, you will have an average in each of those. And you can actually do this in GIS, or you can do this by hand. Once you have that average, to make a scale from 0 to 1, we're actually going to do another division where we're taking the largest ratio and we're dividing all of the numbers by the largest ratio for that variable. When you do that, you will have all of these numbers that come out that vary from 0 to 1 for every variable. And so you'll do that math. It's basically going to be like an inception, right? A ratio of the ratios that you're doing. Not hard math, just more averages to figure out where people are at. And then after you have that, you're going to sum up all the variables in every block and divide by the number of variables. So once again, another average. And after you do that, you will have a number that ranges from 0 to 1 that shows your vulnerability. 1 would be the highest vulnerability that you would have. 0 would be your lowest vulnerability. And once you have all of those calculations from 0 to 1, you can plug that into GIS with the help of your GIS guru. They can symbolize it in GIS. And if you're not educated or experienced with GIS, the classes and the quantile and all of that, ask your GIS guru. They actually are professionals and subject matter experts in knowing how to set it up to where you can easily see the differences between your jurisdiction. But you'll have a resulting map just like this. The map showing is actually social vulnerability for Hurricane Harvey, with all the impacted counties that were under the disaster declaration there. And you can see that the red areas are high vulnerability and the low areas are, or the blue areas are the low vulnerability. And so it's very easy to pinpoint, especially if you're looking at Harris County, the differences of the areas that might have a greater challenge in recovery and might need more outreach, resources, things of that nature. So to jump into some case studies to kind of show what it really looks like. So when I first did this, I did this for Lubbock, Texas. I went to school at Texas Tech University out there. So lived in West Texas for about 6 years, very flat, a lot of severe weather, big hail, tornadoes, all of that kind of thing. And after you create that scale and plug it into ArcMap, you'll have your city layout just like this, to where you can pinpoint certain blocks in your city, certain areas, and be able to determine where your high vulnerable populations are. The variables I used included age, race, education, language, income, household type, because we were trying to gear it more towards tornadoes. So those who lived in mobile homes or structures that would have been damaged easily or would have been very dangerous to be in during a tornado. And then also home age for code needs. Older home ages were considered more vulnerable in the scale. And then after I graduated, moved out there just north of Austin, I did the same thing for Williamson County. And so after I did all of those ratios and plugged it into ArcGIS, you can easily see the green areas are the low vulnerability areas. The red areas are the high vulnerability areas. And once again, we can easily go into those red areas and actually pinpoint and reach out with outreach, resources, things like that, and also planning techniques for shelter needs. Something that's very interesting to note is that Georgetown, Texas is actually a rather nice community. They are very populated. It's actually a retirement community. And so it was very interesting to see that they were highly vulnerable, although the age did come back because they're retirement. And so it is really important after you create these maps to actually go into your communities and either work with nonprofits or work with some other agencies in your area to confirm whether or not your calculations actually align with some of the vulnerability challenges in your area. So next steps after you have your social vulnerability areas identified would be to start outreach campaigns in those areas. Start to assess resource needs that maybe you could start to pre-plan for, start to include in a lot of our response plans. You can also do mitigation projects and kind of prioritize what a lot of our community emergency planning and response tactics look like in those areas. And the really cool thing too would be to test improvement. So if you start doing an educational campaign in a lot of those areas, you can survey people on their preparedness in highly vulnerable blocks, and then do a couple of years of designated outreach to those places, and then go back and resurvey. And you can see if people are becoming more prepared, if you're enhancing the resilience there, other ways that you can kind of measure what a lot of the work is being done in those areas. So to kind of start to wrap this up, I did want to address some of the pros with this method, and then also some of the drawbacks with research, as well as doing mapping and things like that. It's very data heavy, but obviously it's not without error, so it's not 100% accurate. But some of the pros that are included is that it is simple. So the calculations, once you have that GIS person that can help you doing the math and figuring out the data, is simple. It's moldable. So depending on your jurisdiction, you can add variables, you can choose what variables you want to do the maps for. It also gives you a really great layout and overview of the social layout of your community. I think as emergency managers, we all know the significance of knowing your community and knowing how to serve and communicate with your community. And we're always doing that, whether or not it's for emergency planning purposes or THIRAs or things like that. And so having that social layout is a really big benefit, especially when we do have an incident hit where we need to target messaging or target response. And we can have a good estimation on what that's going to look like with our neighborhoods. We can do this on all jurisdictional types. So like I said, city, county, state. You can actually find SVI maps by the CDC on a county level already made on a website. And while that is helpful for state purposes for counties, if you're working for a county, it's better to have that census block group level. So you can go into the county and you can see different areas as opposed to one county being a certain level. Also, like I've mentioned a lot with pre-planning, you can use this to figure out where you're going to put evacuation sheltering, cooling centers, warming centers, sheltering, water pods, food distribution, especially with the pandemic. That's a big one. We use SVI maps here to determine people's food resiliency and try to steer where we're putting those pods so they could be maximized by the people that need them the most.
All right. So a lot of people complained about it the first week we put out. It was too early. So now we're on the week of the 23rd of August.
Somebody is not muted.
So our schools start on the 17th.
Okay. So we're going to have to do an out of sequence.
Hey, Harrison, you're not muted. There you go.
Okay, cool. Thank you. All right, so diving back in, free data. All of this data is free. The only drawback, obviously, is going to be access to GIS. But if you know somebody or your county has that, that's going to be a benefit to you. Some cons associated with this, with census data, especially ACS, we do have some error issues. There's going to be some sampling guesses there. So it's an overall picture, but it's not 100% accurate, like I was saying. We do have generic methods when we're calculating this. We're doing averages. We're not weighting it. I still think it's a good overview of what we can work with. But obviously, with the research and everything else, there's just a lot of questions still in social vulnerability and the variables and how they're significant in people's response and recovery. Downside is definitely having the map savviness or having that resource. And then also social science is hard. It's a challenge. We do know, like I said, with the research that social vulnerability is very impactful in this stuff, but we're still trying to figure out exactly how and how we can apply that, especially in government. So implementation. So we could target the areas, like I said, we could do educational outreach, resource provision, sirens, storm shelters. You can actually do weather radio drives, and that's a really great thing to do, especially in communities that might be threatened by severe weather, tornadoes, nighttime storm risks. They might not have access to internet technology, stuff like that. That's a great way to make sure that they get weather alerts and actually target those people who need that weather alert access. And then also we can do mitigation projects and kind of prioritize where we're doing mitigation to help the community that we need to help the most. And then lastly, situational awareness. So before the incident, we know the areas. We can do the pre-planning there. And then we can also, when we're responding to the incident, incorporate the social vulnerability overview with a lot of the decision-making we're making. Like I said, a good example was the food distribution pods that a lot of people have done, some of the resiliency hubs, some of that kind of response, and then also the messaging. So putting out flyers in Spanish or trying to pinpoint communities with vaccine hesitancy. Those are all great examples of how we can use demographic data to really steer and target the areas that we need to target. So with that being said, I wrapped up a little early, so we'll be open for more questions. But in conclusion, it's really important to understand our community and know the characteristics and demographics that we're working with for pretty much all needs of emergency management, outreach, planning, all of those things. Social vulnerability is definitely a way to do that. It's still evolving and changing in research, and I think that post-pandemic, we'll probably see even more of that since we'll have more data and a better overview of how demographics really affected people during the pandemic. And also, anybody can do this. So I know, like I said, learning math during an emergency management presentation at a conference is probably a little scary or not desirable, but it's very easy math. We can all do it, and all of the data is free. And to be honest, all of us have a lot of tasks, and we have a lot of stuff to do. And so it's really important that we're serving the people that need to be served the best, and we're also building resiliency the best we can and using the tools that we can do so. So with that, thank you guys so much for listening to me talk about social vulnerability. If you have any questions on any of the methods or anything related to that, you can email me at my Baltimore County address down there, or reach out to me on social media, or anyway. I'm very passionate about social vulnerability, so we can definitely talk. Thank you guys so much.
All right, thank you, Ms. Morris, for great information. And there's a question that has been popped up. This has been good. This has been a good presentation on social vulnerability, and I think all understand physical vulnerability. Could you give a brief overview on the psychological vulnerability, please?
Yes, so psychological vulnerability is actually a type of vulnerability that focuses on thought processes and how people develop their brains in certain communities and also around the country. And so a lot of the research done with that is actually comparing like the US and our thought processes here with our culture and how we do things as a country as compared to other countries that have different levels of preparedness. And so it's really looking at that mind development and the psychological way that people think about things like hazard, threat, risk, and how they apply kind of that cultural perspective to actually responding.
All righty, thank you for that. Or anyone else got any questions or comments to toss out in the chat session there? All right, thank you for that comment. Ms. Morris, if you don't mind, can you put your contact information in the chat session? That way they can actually click on it to reach out to you by email and so forth.
Sure, and reach out to, like I said, the presentation, I did provide it to the conference, so it will be up for everybody to download if people are interested in doing the calculations. But if people want to reach out to me, I can email the presentation too, or answer any questions. So all of that is perfect.
Sounds good. Does anyone else have any other comments or questions? Ms. Morris? Thank you for that. All righty, I think it ends it, and I will stop the recording, and we will see everyone back in the main room, I think at 11:05. So I guess we can take a little bit of a short break until then. See everyone in main room 11:05. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.